The transport shuttle descended through Kael'thar's crimson atmosphere with a mechanical groan that echoed through the passenger bay. Commander Elise Varen pressed her face against the reinforced viewport, watching the alien landscape unfold beneath them like a tapestry of rust and copper. Massive crystalline structures jutted from the surface like frozen lightning, their surfaces catching the light of the system's twin suns and scattering it into prismatic shards that painted the clouds in impossible colors. Beside her, Captain Marcus Chun remained perfectly still. His eyes closed in what might have been meditation or simply exhaustion from the 3-month journey through the void. They had crossed half the known galaxy to reach this place, responding to a diplomatic summons that had arrived at Earth's Interstellar Relations Office with all the warmth of a legal summons. The Kael'tharan Empire wanted to discuss humanity's petition for membership in the Galactic Concordat, and their message had been clear: come to their world, play by their rules, and perhaps they would consider allowing Earth's primitive species into the larger community of spacefaring civilizations. Marcus opened one eye and caught Elise staring at him. A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. They had been partners for 7 years, ever since the first contact protocols had been established, and she knew that expression. He was analyzing angles, calculating probabilities, preparing for whatever diplomatic minefield awaited them on the surface. The shuttle's engines shifted pitch as they approached the landing platform, and through the viewport, Elise caught her first glimpse of the reception committee. The Kael'tharan were waiting information, their tall forms draped in flowing garments that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even from this distance, she could sense their posture spoke of arrogance, of beings who considered themselves inherently superior to those they deigned to meet. The landing was smooth, almost unnaturally so, and as the shuttle's doors hissed open, a wave of hot, dry air flooded the passenger bay. It carried with it scents Elise couldn't identify, alien and vaguely metallic, mixed with something that reminded her of ozone after a lightning strike. She straightened her uniform, checked the diplomatic credentials embedded in her wrist device, and followed Marcus down the ramp. The Kael'tharan delegation waited with the patience of statues. There were 7 of them, arranged in a perfect V formation, and at their apex stood a female who radiated authority like a physical force. She was tall, perhaps 7 feet in height, with skin that seemed to shift between deep purple and midnight blue depending on how the light caught it. Her features were sharp and angular, almost predatory, with eyes that glowed with an inner luminescence that marked her as something other, something that evolution had shaped for purposes humanity could barely comprehend. Those eyes fixed on Marcus and Elise with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. The female's lips, darker than the rest of her skin, curved into something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth whatsoever. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords could never produce, a layered sound that seemed to resonate in multiple frequencies simultaneously. "Humans," she said, and the word dripped with contempt so thick it might as well have been viscous. "I am High Justicar Zareth of the Kael'tharan Dominion Council. You stand on sacred ground that has witnessed 10,000 years of our civilization's glory. Try not to embarrass yourselves too thoroughly during your visit." Elise felt her jaw tighten, but Marcus remained perfectly composed. He stepped forward and executed a formal bow that somehow managed to convey respect without subservience, a diplomatic trick he had perfected over years of navigating interstellar politics. "High Justicar," he said, his voice steady and clear. "We are honored by your invitation and grateful for the opportunity to present humanity's case for inclusion in the Concordat. I am Captain Marcus Chun, and this is Commander Elise Varen. We come in peace and with open minds." Zareth made a sound that might have been laughter but held no humor. "Peace, open minds. How quaint. Your species has been spacefaring for what, 40 standard years? We were building stellar navigation systems when your ancestors were still learning to control fire. But very well, we shall observe the formalities. She gestured with one long-fingered hand toward the massive structure behind her. A building that seemed to grow organically from the planet's surface rather than having been constructed upon it. You will be given quarters in the diplomatic wing. Tomorrow you will present your petition to the council. We will listen, we will deliberate, and then we will inform you of our decision. I suggest you prepare your arguments carefully. The council does not look kindly upon wasting their time. The quarters they were assigned were luxurious by any standard, with walls that seemed to breathe and furniture that adjusted itself to accommodate human proportions. But luxury didn't translate to comfort, not when every surface, every angle, every proportion reminded them that they were aliens here, tolerated guests in a civilization that viewed them as little more than curious primitives. Marcus spent the evening reviewing their presentation materials while Elise paced the length of their shared common area, her mind churning through scenarios and contingencies. The Kael'theren clearly had no respect for humanity. That much had been evident from the first words out of Zaretha's mouth. But why invite them here at all if the decision was already made? What game was being played? She voiced her concerns to Marcus, who looked up from his data pad with tired eyes. It's a test, he said simply. They want to see how we respond to contempt, to condescension. They're measuring us. Then they've already decided we're inferior. Perhaps, or perhaps they want to be proven wrong. Either way, we show them what humanity is capable of. We present our case with dignity, with intelligence, and if they reject us, we go home knowing we gave it our best effort. Elise wanted to argue, wanted to rail against the unfairness of it all, but she recognized the futility. Instead, she collapsed onto the adaptive couch and let it mold itself around her body. I hate this, Marcus. I hate feeling like we're begging for scraps from their table. I know, he said softly, but sometimes diplomacy requires swallowing your pride. Get some rest. Tomorrow we make history, one way or another. The council chambers were vast beyond comprehension, a space so large that weather patterns formed near the ceiling. The Kael'theren Council sat on elevated platforms that ringed the central presentation area, looking down on Marcus and Elise like judges at a gladiatorial exhibition. Zareth occupied the highest platform, her form silhouetted against enormous windows that looked out over the alien city beyond. Marcus delivered their presentation with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. He spoke of humanity's achievements, of their rapid technological advancement, of their commitment to peaceful cooperation with other species. He presented data on Earth's resources, on humanity's cultural diversity, on the potential contributions they could make to the Concordat. His words were measured, his arguments logical, his delivery flawless. The council listened in silence that felt oppressive. When Marcus finished and the holographic displays faded, that silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then Zareth leaned forward, her luminous eyes fixed on them with unwavering intensity. "Impressive words," she said, her voice echoing through the vast chamber. "Pretty graphs and charts. But words are wind, and data is decoration. You speak of your species' potential, but we see only weakness. You are fractured, divided into hundreds of nations that can barely cooperate among themselves. Your technology is derivative, borrowed from discoveries made by other species and clumsily adapted. Your lifespans are brief, your body's fragile. Tell me, Captain Chun, why should we allow such a weak species into our prestigious organization? What do you offer that we cannot obtain elsewhere with far less risk?" Marcus's expression remained neutral, but Elise could see the tension in his shoulders. "With respect, High Justicar, diversity is strength, not weakness. Our differences drive innovation, foster creativity, push us to solve problems from multiple angles. And yes, our bodies may be more fragile than yours, but we are resilient in ways that pure physical strength cannot measure. Humanity has survived ice ages, plagues, wars, and environmental disasters. We adapt, we endure, we overcome. Survive, Zareth repeated, her tone mocking. How admirable! You survive like insects survive, through sheer numbers and blind persistence. That is not strength. That is desperation. She rose from her seat, her robes flowing around her like liquid shadow. Your species is weak, Captain. Weak in body, weak in unity, weak in purpose. You come before us asking to be accepted as equals, but you have proven nothing. Words alone are insufficient. Another council member spoke up, his voice deeper but no less dismissive. Perhaps a demonstration is in order. The humans claim resilience, claim the ability to overcome. Let them prove it. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the council, and Zaratha's expression shifted into something that looked almost eager. Yes, she said slowly, a demonstration. How fortunate that we are approaching the festival of Ascension, when our warriors compete to prove their worth. Captain Chun, would your species care to participate? Would you dare to face a Kael'theran champion in the arena of proving? The trap was obvious, sprung so smoothly that Elise knew it had been planned from the beginning. They had never intended to seriously consider Earth's petition. This entire diplomatic mission had been orchestrated to create this moment, to humiliate humanity before the assembled council. If Marcus declined, they would cite it as proof of human cowardice. If he accepted and lost, it would be seen as confirmation of their inferiority. But Marcus didn't hesitate. We accept, he said clearly. Name your champion, and humanity will face them. Zaratha's smile widened, showing teeth that were just slightly too sharp. How brave, how foolish. Very well. Tomorrow at midday, your representative will face champion Corval in single combat. The rules are simple. The match continues until one combatant yields or is rendered unconscious. Weapons are permitted, but lethal force is forbidden by ancient law. Do you agree to these terms? We agree, Marcus replied. The declaration sent a shock through Elisa's system. She grabbed Marcus's arm as soon as they were back in their quarters, her voice sharp with concern. What were you thinking? You saw how big they are, how strong. This is suicide. Marcus turned to face her, and for the first time since they had arrived on Kael'thar, she saw something other than diplomatic composure in his expression. There was determination there, yes, but also a cold, calculating focus that reminded her of who he had been before he became a diplomat. Marcus Chun hadn't always negotiated with words. Before first contact, before the Interstellar Relations Office, he had been a soldier, and not just any soldier. He had been special forces, trained in combat techniques that pushed human capability to its absolute limits. I know exactly what I'm doing, he said quietly. This was always going to happen, Elise. They didn't bring us here to talk. They brought us here to humiliate us, to prove to the Concordat that humanity isn't worth their time or resources. But they made one critical mistake. What's that? They assumed human weakness means we can't fight. They judge us by their standards, by their physical advantages. But combat isn't just about strength or size. It's about strategy, adaptability, and the will to endure beyond what seems possible. Those are things humanity has in abundance. You're going to lose, Marcus, and when you do, Earth's petition will be destroyed. He smiled then, a genuine expression that held more confidence than arrogance. Then I won't lose. The arena of proving was ancient, carved from a single piece of crystalline stone that had been shaped over centuries into a perfect circle 300 feet in diameter. Tiered seating rose up around it, already filled with thousands of Kael'theren who had come to witness what they clearly expected to be a swift and decisive victory for their champion. The noise of their voices created a sound like distant thunder, punctuated by occasional shrieks and calls that reminded Elise of predatory birds. Marcus stood in the preparation chamber, wearing combat attire that the Kael'theren had provided, a form-fitting suit of flexible armor that would protect against the worst injuries while still allowing full range of motion. He was checking the balance of the weapon he had selected, a staff about 6 feet in length made from some kind of energy-conductive metal. It wasn't his first choice, but the Kael'theren weapons available were limited, and he had decided that reach and versatility would serve him better than trying to master an alien sword or blade. Zareth entered the chamber unannounced, her presence filling the space like a physical force. She looked at Marcus with those glowing eyes, studying him with an intensity that felt invasive. "Last chance to withdraw," she said, though her tone made clear she didn't expect him to take the offer. "Corval is undefeated in 237 matches. He has broken bones, shattered pride, and ended careers. He will show you no mercy simply because you are human." Marcus met her gaze without flinching. "I don't want mercy. I want a fair fight." "Fair." Zareth laughed, that same humorless sound. How delightfully naive. "Very well, human. Go meet your defeat with whatever dignity you can muster." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Your species is weak, Captain Chun. What happens in that arena will merely confirm what everyone already knows." The doors opened, and sound crashed over Marcus like a physical wave. The crowd was roaring, chanting in their complex language, and as he stepped onto the crystalline floor of the arena, the noise somehow intensified. He could see Elise in the diplomatic viewing box, her face tight with worry. Around her sat various Concordat observers, representatives from a dozen different species who had come to witness this spectacle. On the opposite side of the arena, another door opened, and Champion Corval emerged to a thunderous ovation. He was massive even by Kael'theren standards, easily 8 feet tall with muscles that looked like they had been carved from stone. His skin was darker than Zareth's, a deep purple that was almost black, and his eyes blazed with crimson light. He carried a double-bladed weapon that looked like a fusion of spear and sword, spinning it casually with one hand in a display of effortless power. An announcer's voice boomed across the arena, speaking in the Kael'theren language before switching to Galactic Standard. "Citizens of the Dominion, honored guests, witness now the festival match between Champion Corval, Blade of the Eastern Dominion, and Captain Marcus Chun of Earth, representing the human species. May the stronger prove their worth." The two combatants approached the center of the arena, and a referee stepped forward, a smaller Kael'theren whose role was to ensure the ancient rules were followed. He looked between them, then raised one hand. "The match begins when my hand falls. It ends when one yields or falls unconscious. Any questions?" Corval said nothing, just stared at Marcus with predatory anticipation. Marcus shook his head once, settling into a ready stance that felt like coming home. Years of training, of discipline, of pushing his body beyond its limits, all condensed into this moment. The referee's hand dropped. Corval moved with shocking speed for someone his size, closing the distance in 2 massive strides and bringing his weapon around in a horizontal slash that would have taken Marcus's head off if it had connected. But Marcus was already moving, dropping into a crouch and rolling forward under the strike. He came up inside Corval's guard and jabbed the end of his staff into the champion's midsection. It was like striking a wall. Corval barely seemed to notice the impact, instead bringing his elbow down toward Marcus's head with bone-crushing force. Marcus twisted away, using his momentum to create distance, his mind already cataloging information. Corval was strong, impossibly strong, and his skin seemed to have a natural armor quality that would make landing effective strikes difficult. But he was also overconfident, used to overwhelming opponents through sheer physical dominance. The champion pressed his attack, his weapon whirling in complex patterns that spoke of decades of training. Marcus gave ground, his staff moving in defensive arcs that deflected rather than blocked. Each impact sent jarring shocks up his arms, and he knew that trying to match Corval's strength would be suicide. Instead, he focused on movement, on staying just ahead of those devastating strikes, on studying the rhythm and timing of his opponent's attacks. The crowd was roaring their approval, clearly expecting Corval to end this quickly. Zareth sat in her elevated box, her expression one of bored satisfaction, already composing the dismissive words she would use when this farce was over. But then something shifted in the arena's dynamic, subtle but unmistakable. Marcus stopped retreating. He planted his feet and met Corval's next strike not with a deflection but with a redirection, using the champion's momentum against him. The staff caught Corval's weapon at an angle and guided it past Marcus's body, and suddenly the human was inside the champion's guard again. This time his strike was different, more focused, targeting a pressure point just below Corval's ribcage with the precision of someone who understood anatomy at a fundamental level. The champion grunted, the first sound he had made since the match began, and for just an instant, his overwhelming offense faltered. Marcus didn't waste the opening. He struck again, this time at the back of Corval's knee, not hard enough to damage but precisely placed to disrupt balance. The massive Kael'Therin stumbled, and the crowd's roar shifted in pitch, surprise mixing with their bloodlust. Corval recovered quickly, but something had changed in his eyes. The contemptuous confidence had been replaced by actual focus. He was no longer fighting a weak human. He was fighting an opponent. His attacks became more measured, more calculated, and Marcus responded in kind. The arena floor rang with the sound of weapons meeting, of footwork on crystalline stone, of two combatants testing each other's limits. Elise watched from the viewing box, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Around her, the alien observers were leaning forward, their various forms of attention fixed on the combat below. This wasn't going as they had expected, and the uncertainty was clearly unsettling. In her elevated box, Zareth was no longer lounging in bored satisfaction. She was sitting forward, her glowing eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that had shifted from dismissive to something else entirely. How was this possible? Corval was one of their finest warriors, trained from childhood in combat arts that had been refined over millennia. Yet the human was not just surviving. He was adapting, learning, exploiting weaknesses that shouldn't have existed. Marcus could feel his body beginning to tire. The Kael'Therin physiology gave them greater stamina as well as strength, and he knew that a prolonged battle would inevitably favor his opponent. He needed to end this, needed to find a way through Corval's defenses before his own reserves ran out. So he took a calculated risk. He feinted left, drawing Corval's weapon in that direction. Then instead of following through, he reversed and lunged right. The staff extended fully as he channeled every ounce of strength and momentum into a strike aimed at Corval's head. The champion tried to bring his weapon up to block, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. The end of Marcus's staff connected with the side of Corval's skull with a crack that echoed across the suddenly silent arena. The massive Kael'Therin staggered, his eyes losing focus. For a moment, he seemed to hover on the edge of consciousness, his body swaying like a tree in a strong wind. Then his legs buckled, and he crashed to the crystalline floor with an impact that sent vibrations through the arena's structure. The referee rushed forward, checking Corval's condition. The champion was breathing but clearly unconscious, His massive form sprawled across the arena floor. The referee straightened, looked at Marcus, and raised one hand in the traditional signal of victory. Silence. Complete and total silence from thousands of Kael'theren who had come expecting to witness their champion's inevitable triumph. Then, slowly, like ice beginning to crack, sound returned to the arena. It wasn't the roar of approval that had greeted Corval's entrance. It was something more complex, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and perhaps something like grudging respect. Marcus stood over his fallen opponent, his body screaming with exhaustion, every muscle trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. His armor was scuffed and dented. His face was covered in sweat that stung his eyes, and he was pretty sure he had cracked at least one rib. But he was standing, and Corval was not. He looked up toward the viewing boxes, found Zareth's elevated position, and their eyes met across the distance. Her expression was unreadable, but something had shifted in that glowing gaze. The contempt was gone, replaced by something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Interest, perhaps, or recognition. The medical team rushed onto the arena floor to tend to Corval, and Marcus was escorted back to the preparation chamber. His legs felt like they might give out at any moment, and the adrenaline crash was hitting him hard. He barely made it to a bench before collapsing onto it, his head spinning with a combination of exhaustion and the sheer unreality of what had just happened. Elise burst into the chamber moments later, her face a mixture of relief and exhilaration. Marcus, I can't even, you actually did it. He managed a weak smile. Told you I wouldn't lose. You look like hell. Feel worse. But we proved the point. That's what matters. The door opened again, and Marcus looked up expecting to see medical staff. Instead, Zareth stood in the doorway, her tall form filling the frame. She dismissed Elise with a gesture that brooked no argument, and despite wanting to protest, the commander recognized authority when she saw it. She withdrew, leaving Marcus alone with the High Justicar. Zareth approached slowly, her movements fluid and predatory. She studied Marcus with those glowing eyes, taking in every detail of his exhausted, battered form. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its harsh edge. That should not have been possible, she said. Corval has defeated opponents twice your size, 3 times your strength. Yet you stand while he lies unconscious in the medical wing. Explain this to me. Marcus met her gaze, too tired to be diplomatic. You assumed weakness meant inability. You judged humanity by your standards and found us lacking. But you missed what makes us dangerous. And what is that? We're underestimated. We're dismissed. And that gives us an advantage that all your strength and technology can't match. You see weakness. We see opportunity. You see limitation. We see a challenge to overcome. That's what you don't understand about humanity. We're weak compared to you, yes. But we're also too stubborn to let that stop us. Something flickered across Zareth's face, an expression so complex Marcus couldn't parse it. She moved closer, close enough that he could see the subtle patterns in her skin, the way the light played across her features. You stood over my champion, covered in sweat and blood, and you defeated him through skill and determination. I have never seen such a thing from one I considered weak. Maybe your definition of weakness needs revision, Marcus said. Perhaps. She reached out one long-fingered hand and touched his face, her fingers cool against his heated skin. The gesture was so unexpected that Marcus froze, unsure how to respond. You have forced me to reconsider my assumptions, Captain Marcus Chen. That is not something that happens often. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I am not yet certain. Her hand withdrew, but she remained close, studying him with an intensity that felt different from her earlier contempt. This was something else, something Marcus recognized from his years of reading people, of understanding the subtle cues that revealed true thoughts beneath diplomatic masks. It was interest, genuine and unexpected. It was attraction. "The council will convene tomorrow to discuss your petition," Zareth continued, her voice regaining some of its formal tone even as her eyes betrayed deeper feelings. "What you did today will influence their decision. You have proven that humanity possesses qualities we did not anticipate. Whether that will be enough remains to be seen. But you're reconsidering," Marcus said. "It wasn't a question. I am reconsidering many things." She turned toward the door, then paused. "You should rest. Your injuries require attention, and tomorrow will bring its own challenges. But know this, human, you have my respect. That is not something I grant easily." She left without waiting for a response, and Marcus was alone with his exhaustion and his confused thoughts. The encounter had been strange, charged with undercurrents he hadn't expected. Zareth's entire demeanor had shifted from contemptuous dismissal to something far more complex. The way she had looked at him, touched him, that hadn't been the gesture of a superior to an inferior. That had been something else entirely. The medical staff arrived and treated his injuries, which turned out to be less severe than he had feared. A cracked rib, some deep bruising, minor cuts. Nothing that wouldn't heal with time and proper care. They offered him advanced Kael'therin healing treatments, which he accepted gratefully, and by the time Elise was allowed back into the chamber, he was already feeling significantly better. What did she want? Elise asked immediately, her diplomatic instincts telling her that Zareth's private visit meant something important. "I'm not entirely sure," Marcus admitted. "But I think we just changed the game." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. His body was exhausted. His healing injuries ached despite the medical treatments. But his mind wouldn't stop replaying the day's events. The fight itself seemed almost surreal in retrospect. He had faced opponents in training, had been in combat situations before first contact, but nothing quite like matching himself against an alien warrior who outclassed him in virtually every physical category. But it wasn't the fight that kept him awake. It was the look in Zareth's eyes when she had touched his face. It was the shift in her voice, the complexity of emotions that had played across her features. She had seen him as weak, as beneath her consideration, and then something fundamental had changed. Not just respect, though that was part of it. Something deeper, something that felt almost primal. He rose from bed and walked to the window, looking out over the alien city with its crystalline spires and flowing architecture. Somewhere out there, in the vast complex of the council buildings, Zareth was probably doing the same thing, wrestling with thoughts and feelings that didn't fit neatly into her worldview. The next morning brought a summons, but not the one Marcus had expected. Instead of being called before the full council, he was requested to attend a private breakfast with High Justicar Zareth in her personal chambers. Elisa's eyes widened when she heard the news. "That's highly unusual," she said, checking her data pad for precedence. Kael'therin officials don't typically socialize with petitioners, especially not in private settings. This could be a diplomatic opportunity or a trap. Or maybe it's just breakfast, Marcus suggested, though he didn't believe it any more than Elise did. Zareth's chambers were located in the highest tower of the council complex, a space that seemed to exist at the boundary between architecture and art. The walls were not solid but composed of flowing energy fields that shifted colors based on some principle Marcus couldn't immediately determine. Furniture grew organically from the floor, shaped by what must have been incredibly advanced technology to look like natural formations. Zareth waited for him on a balcony that overlooked the entire city, her form silhouetted against the morning light of the twin suns. She wore less formal attire than he had seen before, garments that were still elegant but seemed more personal, less about projecting authority and more about comfort. When she turned to face him, her expression was surprisingly open. "Thank you for accepting my invitation," she said, gesturing to a table that held various dishes of Caeltheran cuisine. "I thought we might speak more freely away from the formalities of the council chambers." Marcus approached cautiously, his diplomatic training warring with his instinct that something significant was happening here. "I appreciate the hospitality, High Justicar, though I admit I'm uncertain about the purpose of this meeting." "Zareth," she corrected. "When we are alone, you may use my name, and the purpose is simple enough. I wish to understand you better, to comprehend how I so thoroughly misjudged your species." They sat, and Zareth served food with her own hands, a gesture that Marcus understood was significant even if he didn't fully grasp all the cultural implications. The meal was surprisingly pleasant, the food strange but not unpalatable, and as they ate, they talked. Not about diplomacy or the Concordat, but about their lives, their worlds, their perspectives on the vast and complicated universe they inhabited. Zareth spoke of the Caeltheran philosophy, of their belief in strength as the ultimate virtue, in power as the measure of worth. She explained how their society had been built on these principles for thousands of years, creating a civilization that was undeniably advanced but also, Marcus realized, somewhat stagnant. When your entire culture revolves around being superior, where is the motivation to grow, to change, to question fundamental assumptions? In turn, Marcus described Earth, painting a picture of a world filled with diversity and contradiction. He spoke of human history, of failures and triumphs, of the constant struggle to be better than they were. He didn't try to make humanity sound perfect or even particularly noble. Instead, he was honest about their flaws, their conflicts, their ongoing challenges. "We're messy," he admitted. "We argue, we disagree, we sometimes go to war with ourselves over ideas and resources and pride. But we also create art that moves the soul, science that expands understanding, and connections between individuals that transcend logic. We're weak in many ways, yes, but we're also endlessly creative in finding ways to overcome that weakness." Zareth listened with an intensity that felt almost physical. Her glowing eyes never left his face, and as he spoke, Marcus could see her processing not just his words, but the implications behind them. This was a being who had built her entire identity around a specific worldview, and now that worldview was being challenged in ways she had never anticipated. "When I watched you in the arena," she said finally, "I felt something I have not experienced in a very long time. At first, I thought it was merely surprise at an unexpected outcome. But as you stood over Corval, your body showing every sign of the battle you had endured, I realized it was something else entirely." "What was it?" Marcus asked, though part of him already knew. "Attraction," Zareth said simply, her directness somehow more impactful than any elaborate confession. "Not despite your weakness, but because of how you transcended it. In Caeltheran culture, we value strength, but we have forgotten that there are many forms of strength. You reminded me of that truth, and in doing so, you became something I find compelling." The admission hung in the air between them, complex and charged with implications that went far beyond personal feelings. Zareth was a High Justicar, one of the most powerful individuals in the Caeltheran dominion. For her to express attraction to a human, to someone she had initially dismissed as weak and inferior, was a statement that could reshape diplomatic relations. Marcus chose his words carefully. "I'm honored by your honesty, Zareth, and I won't pretend I don't feel a connection here. But this is complicated in ways that go beyond personal feelings." "You fear the political implications," she said, and it wasn't a question. You worry that any personal relationship between us would compromise the diplomatic process, would raise questions about motives and manipulation. The thought had crossed my mind, yes. Zareth rose from her seat and walked to the edge of the balcony, her hands gripping the railing as she looked out over her city. My people will not understand, she said quietly. They will see it as weakness on my part, as a betrayal of our values. And your people will wonder if you are using personal connection to advance political goals. Both concerns are valid. Both create genuine obstacles. Marcus joined her at the railing, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough to speak softly. So what do? We are honest, Zareth said, turning to face him. With ourselves, with our peoples, with the consequences that may follow. I cannot deny what I feel, Marcus Chun, and I suspect you cannot either. The question is whether we are brave enough to acknowledge it, knowing the complications that will result. It would have been easy to step back, to maintain professional distance, to prioritize the diplomatic mission over personal feelings. That would have been the safe choice, the pragmatic choice. But Marcus had never been someone who chose safety over authenticity, and as he looked into Zareth's glowing eyes, he made a decision that would change everything. I'm attracted to you too, he said. To your strength, yes, but also to the complexity I see beneath it. To the way you're willing to question assumptions that your entire culture takes for granted. That takes a different kind of courage, one that I find compelling. Zareth's expression softened into something that might have been vulnerability. She reached out, slower this time, giving Marcus every opportunity to pull away. When he didn't, her hand cupped his face again, and this time the touch lingered. This will not be simple, she warned. Nothing worthwhile ever is, Marcus replied. What happened next felt inevitable, as if the universe itself had been conspiring to bring them to this moment. Zareth leaned down, closing the height difference between them, and their lips met in a kiss that carried all the complexity of their situation. It was gentle but intense, tentative but passionate, a collision of two beings from different worlds learning to find common ground. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing harder than expected. Zareth's skin had shifted to a deeper purple, and Marcus realized this might be the Kael'Theran equivalent of blushing. The thought made him smile, which in turn made Zareth's lips curve into a more genuine expression than he had yet seen from her. We should probably discuss what this means, Marcus said, his diplomatic training reasserting itself even as his heart was still racing. Later, Zareth replied. For now, let us simply experience this moment without overanalyzing every implication. They spent the rest of the morning together, talking and occasionally falling into comfortable silence. Zareth showed Marcus her personal collection of artifacts from across the galaxy, each piece representing a different culture, a different way of existing in the universe. It was a side of her that no one else saw, a private acknowledgement that despite her culture's focus on Kael'Theran superiority, she was deeply curious about other forms of life. Marcus shared stories from Earth, pulling up images and videos on his datapad, showing her the diversity of human experience. He showed her music, art, natural wonders, and the everyday beauty of people just living their lives. Zareth absorbed it all with the intensity of someone discovering a new dimension of reality. By the time Marcus had to leave for the afternoon council session, something fundamental had shifted between them. They had crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed, had acknowledged feelings that would inevitably influence everything that followed. As Marcus departed, Zareth caught his hand, her touch lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. Whatever the council decides today, she said, know that you have changed my perspective permanently. That is worth more than any political accommodation. The council chambers felt different when Marcus entered them that afternoon. Word of his victory over Corval had spread, and the assembled Caeltheran representatives regarded him with expressions that ranged from grudging respect to open hostility. Zareth sat in her elevated position, her face carefully neutral, giving no indication of the mourning they had shared. The senior council member who had suggested the arena challenge rose to speak. "We have deliberated on humanity's petition for inclusion in the Galactic Concordat. Captain Chen's unexpected victory over Champion Corval has given us much to consider. It has demonstrated that physical weakness does not necessarily equate to inability, and that human adaptability may indeed be an asset rather than a liability." Marcus listened carefully, trying to gauge which direction the verdict would go. Beside him, Elise was rigid with tension. However, the council member continued, "One victory does not erase our concerns about humanity's fractured nature, their brief history of space exploration, or their technological dependence on other species' discoveries. The question before us is whether the qualities Captain Chen displayed are representative of humanity as a whole, or merely an exception that proves the rule of human weakness." Zareth rose from her seat, and the chamber fell silent. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of absolute authority. "I have spent time with Captain Chun beyond the formal proceedings. I have discussed philosophy, culture, and perspective with him, and I have concluded that what we witnessed in the arena yesterday was not an exception, but an example of humanity's fundamental nature." A murmur ran through the assembled council. This was clearly not the position they had expected Zareth to take. She continued, her words measured but forceful. "Humanity is weak by our standards, yes, but they have taken that weakness and transformed it into a catalyst for innovation, adaptation, and persistence. They do not have our longevity, so they compress incredible achievement into brief lifespans. They do not have our unified culture, so they generate diversity of thought that drives creativity. They do not have our technological advancement, so they learn to leverage what they can access in novel ways." She paused, her glowing eyes sweeping across the council before settling on Marcus. "I propose that humanity be granted provisional membership in the Concordat, with full evaluation to occur after a 10-year period. This will allow us to assess their continued development while giving them access to the resources and connections that membership provides. And it will allow the Concordat to benefit from human perspective, which I believe will prove more valuable than we currently recognize." The debate that followed was intense, with various council members arguing both for and against Zareth's proposal. But her authority carried significant weight, and gradually, the opposition began to crumble. When the final vote was called, humanity's provisional membership was approved by a narrow margin. Marcus and Elise accepted the decision with appropriate dignity, expressing gratitude for the opportunity while acknowledging the responsibilities it entailed. But underneath the diplomatic formalities, both were processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Humanity had taken its first real step toward becoming part of the larger galactic community. That evening, there was a formal reception to mark the decision, attended by council members, diplomatic representatives from various Concordat species, and other dignitaries. Marcus moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting congratulations and deflecting questions about the arena match with humble responses that didn't quite capture the full truth of the experience. He caught sight of Zareth across the room, surrounded by her own circle of admirers and critics. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. They would need to be careful, would need to navigate this new dynamic with intelligence and discretion. But the connection was real, acknowledged, and neither was willing to pretend it didn't exist. Later, after the official functions had concluded and most attendees had departed, Marcus found himself once again on a balcony overlooking the city. He wasn't surprised when Zareth appeared beside him, her approach silent despite her height. "You handled today well," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been present in her public statements. The council was impressed, even those who voted against the measure. "I had a compelling advocate," Marcus replied. "Your speech made the difference. I spoke honestly. That is all any of us can do." She moved closer, and Marcus was struck again by how natural it felt to be near her, despite the obvious differences between them. "This will be complicated, Marcus. The political ramifications of our personal connection will create challenges neither of us can fully anticipate." "I know," he said, "but I think it's worth it. Not just for diplomatic reasons, though that matters, but because what we've found here is rare. Understanding across such different perspectives, attraction that transcends physical form, connection that challenges fundamental assumptions. That's not something to walk away from easily." Zareth's hand found his, her long fingers intertwining with his smaller ones. The gesture was tender, intimate, a private acknowledgement of feelings that would eventually become public. "My people will struggle to understand," she said. "Some will see it as betrayal, others as weakness. I am prepared for that resistance. And Earth will have its own questions," Marcus added, "about motives, about power dynamics, about whether this is genuine or strategic. We'll face skepticism from both sides. Then we face it together," Zareth said simply, "with honesty, with patience, and with the knowledge that what we feel is authentic, regardless of what others may believe." They stood together in comfortable silence, looking out over the alien city as its lights began to glow in the gathering darkness. In the distance, the twin suns were setting, painting the crystalline structures in shades of amber and rose. It was beautiful in a way that was entirely foreign to Marcus, yet somehow he was beginning to understand it, to appreciate the aesthetic on its own terms rather than comparing it to Earth standards. "Tell me about your home," Zareth said suddenly. "Not the facts and figures you presented to the council, but the feeling of it. What do you miss most about Earth?" Marcus considered the question, sorting through memories and emotions. "Rain," he said finally. "I know that sounds strange, but I miss the smell of rain on concrete, the sound of it against windows. I miss seasonal changes, the way the world transforms itself multiple times a year. I miss diversity not just of people but of environments, how you can be in a desert one day and a forest the next. We have environmental variety on Kaeldar," Zareth pointed out. "I know, but it's different. It's beautiful, but it's not mine. Not in the way Earth is mine, shaped by human hands and human history and human mistakes. Does that make sense?" "More than you might think," Zareth replied. "I have traveled to dozens of worlds in my role as Justicar, and each has its own beauty, its own wonder. But Kaeldar is home in a way no other place can be. It is where my ancestors walked, where my culture was born, where I learned to see the universe. That connection transcends logic." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "We're more alike than either of our peoples wants to admit. Perhaps that is precisely why our connection matters," Zareth said. "Because it demonstrates that commonality exists even across vast differences. That understanding is possible if we are willing to look past surface assumptions." They talked late into the night, sharing stories and perspectives, learning the contours of each other's thoughts and feelings. Zareth spoke of the pressure of her position, of the weight of representing values she was beginning to question. Marcus described the isolation of being humanity's representative, of carrying the hopes and fears of billions on his shoulders. In the quiet hours before dawn, as exhaustion finally began to overtake them both, Marcus asked a question that had been nagging at him since their first private breakfast. Why me, Zareth? I know you're attracted to what I represent, to the qualities I displayed in the arena. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? Zareth was silent for a long moment, considering her response with the same careful deliberation she brought to council decisions. You are the first being I have met who made me question fundamental assumptions about strength and worth, she said finally. That is intoxicating in ways I did not anticipate. My entire life has been built on certainties, on beliefs that seemed unshakable. And then you entered that arena and shattered them through sheer determination and intelligence. You did not become strong in Kael'theren terms. You redefined what strength means. That kind of paradigm shift, it awakens something dormant, something I did not know existed within me. A desire for growth, Marcus suggested. Yes, and a recognition that there are forms of excellence I have never considered. You embody that recognition, Marcus Chin. When I am with you, I see possibilities that extend beyond the rigid frameworks of my culture. That is deeply, powerfully attractive. Marcus pulled her closer, and she adjusted her position to accommodate their height difference, her head resting against his shoulder in a gesture that was probably unprecedented in Kael'theren history. We're going to change things, he said softly. Not just politically, but culturally. Our relationship, whatever form it takes, will challenge assumptions on both our worlds. I am aware, Zareth replied, and I find myself surprisingly unconcerned with the chaos that may result. Change is necessary, even when it is uncomfortable. Perhaps especially when it is uncomfortable. The days that followed were a whirlwind of diplomatic activity. Marcus and Elise met with representatives from various concordat species, establishing initial relationships and laying groundwork for future cooperation. The provisional membership meant Earth would have limited voting rights and access to certain technologies, but it was a start, a foundation on which to build. Throughout this process, Marcus and Zareth maintained a careful balance between their public and private lives. In official settings, they were professional, cordial, giving no obvious indication of the depth of their personal connection. But they found time for private meetings, stolen hours where they could simply be themselves without the weight of their respective positions. Elise noticed, of course. She was too observant, too skilled at reading interpersonal dynamics to miss the subtle changes in Marcus's demeanor. One evening, she confronted him directly, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. You're involved with her, aren't you? With Zareth. There was no point in denying it. Yes. Marcus, this could compromise everything we've worked for. If people think you're manipulating her or she's manipulating you, it will undermine the entire diplomatic relationship. I know, Marcus said, but it's not manipulation, Elise. It's genuine connection, and we're both aware of the complications. We're trying to handle it carefully. Elise sighed, running a hand through her hair in frustration. I believe you, but that doesn't mean everyone else will. You're going to face serious scrutiny when this becomes public, and it will become public eventually. Are you prepared for that? As prepared as I can be, Marcus replied. Look, I understand the risks, but some things are worth the complexity they create. This is one of them. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, I trust your judgment, even if I think you're making this much harder than it needs to be. Just promise me you'll be careful. Both of you have too much to lose if this goes badly. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after the initial council decision, during a formal dinner celebrating the start of Earth's provisional membership. Marcus was seated next to a representative from the Telkari species, a methane-breathing civilization that communicated through bioluminescent patterns. Through a translation interface, They were discussing comparative philosophy when Zareth approached their section of the table. "Captain Chun, if you have a moment, there is a matter I would like to discuss privately." It was phrased as a request, but Marcus recognized the tone. This was important. He excused himself and followed Zareth to a private alcove off the main dining hall. Once they were alone, her formal demeanor softened slightly. "The Council has received a request from Earth's Interstellar Relations Office," she said. "They wish to send a larger diplomatic contingent to Kael'thar to establish permanent embassy facilities and begin deeper integration with Concordat systems. The request included a specific recommendation that you remain here as Earth's primary representative during this transition period." Marcus processed the implications. That could be months, possibly longer. "Yes, and given our personal situation, I wanted you to hear this from me directly before the official notification arrives. If you accept, we will have more time together. But it will also mean more scrutiny, more opportunities for our relationship to become public knowledge. I will not influence your decision, but I wanted you to understand the full context." "You want me to stay?" Marcus said, making it a statement rather than a question. "I do," Zareth admitted. "But I also recognize that desire may not align with what is best for you, for Earth, or for the diplomatic process. The choice must be yours." Marcus thought about Earth, about returning home after this extraordinary experience. He thought about the life he had built there, the routines and relationships that comprised normalcy. Then he thought about what he had found here on this alien world, with this remarkable being who had forced him to reconsider his own assumptions about connection and possibility. "I'll stay," he said, "not just because of us, though that matters, but because I think the work here is important, and I'm in a unique position to advance it. And yes, because I want more time with you, to see where this leads." Relief and pleasure flickered across Zareth's features. "I was hoping you would say that, though I suspect we have merely exchanged one set of complications for another." "Probably," Marcus agreed, "but at least they'll be interesting complications." The months that followed were transformative in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. Marcus worked to establish Earth's first permanent diplomatic presence on Kael'thar, navigating the complex web of Concordat politics while also learning to understand Kael'tharan culture from the inside. Zareth, in turn, found herself increasingly drawn into human perspectives, studying Earth history and philosophy with the dedication she had once reserved for Kael'tharan martial arts. Their relationship deepened naturally, progressing from initial attraction to something more substantial. They learned each other's languages, not just the words but the underlying concepts and cultural frameworks that shaped meaning. Zareth taught Marcus the intricate dance-like communication style that Kael'tharan used in formal settings, while Marcus introduced her to human customs of humor and casual affection that were foreign to her more rigid upbringing. The inevitable happened 4 months after Marcus agreed to stay. A journalist from one of the Concordat's major information networks published a piece speculating about the nature of Marcus and Zareth's relationship, complete with surveillance images that captured them in moments of obvious intimacy. The story spread rapidly through Concordat channels, generating heated debate about the appropriateness of such a connection between a high justicar and a representative of a provisional member species. Marcus and Zareth decided to address the situation directly rather than allowing speculation to control the narrative. They called a joint press conference, standing together before representatives from dozens of different species and media organizations. Zareth spoke first, her voice clear and unwavering. "It has been brought to my attention that there is considerable interest in my personal relationship with Captain Marcus Chun. Rather than allow rumor and speculation to define this situation, we have chosen to address it directly. Yes, Marcus and I are romantically involved. This began after humanity's arena demonstration, and has continued to develop alongside our professional interactions. We acknowledge that this creates complexity, but we also believe that authentic connection across species boundaries demonstrates the very ideals that the Concordat claims to represent. Marcus continued from there, his words carefully chosen to address both Caeltheran and human concerns. I understand that many will question whether my relationship with Zareth has influenced diplomatic outcomes. I can only offer my honest assurance that our personal connection and our professional responsibilities remain distinct. Earth's provisional membership was earned through demonstrated capability, not personal favor. What Zareth and I have found together is separate from those political considerations, even as we acknowledge the complications it creates. The questions that followed were predictably pointed, ranging from the practical to the philosophical to the outright invasive. But Marcus and Zareth faced them together, presenting a united front that refused to apologize for feelings that transcended cultural boundaries. By the end of the conference, they had not silenced all critics, but they had established their own narrative, one of authenticity and courage in the face of social pressure. The fallout was significant but not catastrophic. Some council members called for Zareth's resignation, claiming she had compromised her position. Others, surprisingly, defended her right to personal relationships regardless of political complications. On Earth, reactions were similarly mixed.